Number one, don't be overbearing. He says, number two, within our lives, don't be quick-tempered. Don't be quick-tempered. It's interesting because there's two different Greek words for having a temper, or for having anger. The one is the word which refers to somebody that blows up. You know, you're talking and all of a sudden, wham! It just, bam! The short fuse idea? I wake you all up? The short fuse idea. That it poof! It explodes, but then after about 3 or 4 minutes it's all done and it's like, oh yeah, you still love me, I still love you. Okay, everything's fine. That's the one definition, Greek word for anger. What Paul is using here is the definition or the word which means nursing the anger and the slow-growing anger. And you get a little frustrated and you're mad, and then a week later something happens, you get a little madder, and 2 or 3 weeks later, and you're nursing the anger, and you start talking bad about somebody else. And we start gossiping about somebody else, and we do those little snide comments about somebody else. That's what Paul's talking about here. You need to realize he's not saying the outbursts of anger are good, not that at all. But the word here is that nursing the anger, the long-term anger that continues in our life, which ends up becoming like a tumor or cancer, which starts small and starts to overtake a certain part of our body. This type of anger is like that tumor or cancer, which may start small, but as we nourish it or nurture it and allow it to grow, it overtakes us. In some respects, it's like the story or the parable of the Indian chief talking to his grandson. And the grandson's talking about the fact, within our life we have lots of choices on what's going on in our life. And the Indian chief says, well, on one shoulder we have a one wolf, and the other shoulder we have another wolf. And the grandson says, well, between this fight of the wolves, who's going to win? And the grandpa says, whichever one we feed. That's what Paul's talking about here. If we nourish and nurture our anger, it grows up and takes over. So Paul says, don't be overbearing, don't be quick-tempered, quick-angered, but also don't be given to drunkenness. Don't be given to drunkenness. Don't overindulge in wine. I think it's amazing that on some stores it's called wine and spirit sold here. Some of you hopefully have seen that before. Wine and spirits sold here. Why do they call it spirits? Because it takes over our spirit. It takes over who we are. So what does Paul say? He says, don't be given to drunkenness. But it's interesting too, because this idea of drunkenness, it even goes deeper. And the Greek definition goes in a different area that maybe some of you may say. Some of you may say, man, we've never been drunk. We don't do that. We don't plan on doing that. This doesn't affect us at all. No. What the word here is meaning, besides the drinking, is don't act in outrageous ways like a man or woman who is drunk. Don't be outrageous. Which takes you back to number 2, don't be quick-tempered. Takes you back to number 1, don't be overbearing. See how they fit together? Don't act outrageously like a drunk person and be overbearing or quick-tempered. We have the next one is, Paul says, we are called not to be violent. We're called not to be violent. Now, some of you may think, how many of us have actually hit somebody? Well, I know I've never gotten in a fight with somebody and physically been involved with that. I know some of you maybe have, as you're smiling. Some of you may have been involved like that within your life before. Well, it's interesting because at this time and some years later, pastors could be a bit overzealous and physically chastise. You know what that word means? Physically discipline their members. So much so that within one of the writings way back in the early Christendom, it's the writings from the apostolic canons, it said, "We order that the bishop who strikes an erring believer should be disposed." So there were actually pastors or leaders who were physically hitting their parishioners to get them back in line. Yeah, a little surprising. Now, I don't think I've ever done that. Hopefully I've never done that in my life. But Paul says, no, we cannot do that. We cannot be a striker. But it even goes again deeper. It's just not that physical, but we cannot verbally abuse somebody else. Verbally get them to be, if you want to say, back in line. See that these things even go deeper than what we may think they are. Drunkenness, oh man, that just refers to those people who drink too much. No, it refers if we act outrageously. You can't be violent. Okay, that's the physical, but it's also the verbal. How are we with each other verbally? Paul goes on here and says, not pursuing dishonest gain. In other words, the idea here is that people on the island of Crete were known to be liars and cheats and lovers of money. That's just not the New Testament saying that. That's their own writings. That's the poet from 500 BC talks about that. Paul says, don't pursue dishonest gain, but work for a wage. What does Jesus say? He says, money is the root of all evil. Oh, he doesn't say that, does he? He says the love of money is the root of all evil. Money is not evil in and of itself, but when we lift it up and we say by any gains we want to achieve that, that's the root of evil. Paul says, don't pursue dishonest gain to provide for yourself and for your family. The next ideas that Paul brings out here are things that an elder, or those of us who say we're a Christian, are called to do to other people, or called to walk with other people. The first one Paul says is that we're called to be hospitable. Hospitable. Within the world at that time, the inns, the hotels, the motels were notoriously not safe places to go. So if you were a traveling itinerant preacher or elder and you went to different towns, you really wanted to stay with other believers. You didn't want to stay at the local inn. Our inns today are safe. Theirs were not. Hospitality was a huge aspect for them to open up their doors to each other. Hospitality still in the Middle East is a huge aspect of who they are. Opening up their doors to each other. So my question to you is your door open? I mean, if I stop by your house, is it open? Or do you say, oh man, here comes the pastor, shut the door, shut the windows, you know? We don't want them in. You've done that, Dave? So the question is, how do we do that? I mean, are we actually open to each other, or... I was with my dad quite a few years ago, and we wanted to stop at another pastor's house, and he knew this pastor quite well and the pastor's wife. And I said, well, Dad, let's stop and talk to him. They had just built a new house and whatnot. And my dad said, no, we better not. And I said, well, why not? He's a pastor. He's a reformed pastor. Let's stop and let's talk to him. You want to see his house. You love houses. No, we can't do that. Why not? Well, he likes to meet people at church, but his home is his home. Well, you can imagine for me, that got my intense, immediate anger of, what? He's a pastor. What are you talking about, Dad? So my question to you, are you open to other believers? Are we open to other people in our community? Are we hospitable to them? Paul goes on here and says what we're called to with others is that we need to love what is good. And the Greek here is loving what is good is loving people who are good and loving things that are good. New Testament also says whatever is lovely, whatever is pure, whatever is honorable, think on these things. Genesis says God created it and He called it good.